No way a human can survive that, not without armor. The words echoed across the training field like a verdict, not a prediction, and every alien cadet within earshot felt the weight of that sentence pressed down like gravity. There in the center of the arena, under the glaring lights, stood a human completely exposed, bare-chested. Not a single piece of protective gear or advanced shielding adorned his frame. He was a stark contrast to every known protocol, every expectation, every rule the Academy had ever upheld for combat drills, even the holographic targets program to test the reflexes and tactical awareness of cadets paused for a beat, as if uncertain what to do with a target. So unprotected above them, on a raised platform, the Teru instructor, a towering reptilian figure with armored ridges running down his back, glared with disdain. His arms crossed over his massive chest as his voice sliced through the tension. "Begin the drill," he barked, and suddenly everything came to life with a flash of light and synthetic motion as the holograms activated around the human, snapping into positions of attack in a perfect formation. This wasn't an ordinary drill. It was the kind meant to crush confidence, meant to punish overconfidence, and expose any flaw in a cadet's technique. Each hologram bore a different threat, a slashing blade, a surging spear, a crushing energy hammer. Any one of these weapons had enough force in their simulation to disable even a fully armored combatant. But the human stood there calm, almost bored, as if the chaos around him were a minor inconvenience, something he'd dealt with 1,000 times before. His arms hung loosely at his sides, his posture relaxed, his breathing steady. Then the first attack launched a spearhead, hurtled from his left, aiming directly at his ribs. A strike meant to test agility and peripheral awareness without hesitation, and with an eerie smoothness, the human twisted his body to the side, catching the spear shaft in one hand and yanking it forward, using its momentum to send the attacker stumbling off balance. There was a moment of stunned silence among the alien cadets, not because he'd avoided the blow, but because he made it look easy. No armor, no shield, no energy dampeners, and yet he moved like he'd seen the attack coming before it was ever launched. This was not what they had trained for. This was not how the drill was supposed to go. The Wreath cadet named Vu, his skin a pale shimmer of silver and blue, whispered to the Siran, standing beside him. "How is he doing that? I heard humans need armor just to survive their own planet, much less something like this." The Siran's eyes were fixed on the human, narrowed and scanning every movement. "I don't know," he said slowly, "but this is madness. He shouldn't even be standing. The kinetic force alone should be knocking him down." And yet in the center of the training ground, the human moved with elegance, his muscles shifting under bare skin like coiled ropes of iron. The next attack came from above, a heavy mace, crashing down with simulated force that could shatter bones. He stepped to the side just enough to avoid the arc, then delivered a punch to the hologram's midsection, causing it to glitch and fade out of combat range again. Silence followed, a deeper, heavier silence this time, because the attack had been nearly impossible to dodge without a reactive shield. And yet the human didn't just dodge, he countered effectively. It wasn't bravado, not some exaggerated show of machismo. This was control, pure and refined. His face showed no signs of arrogance, just calculation and discipline. Each movement carefully measured, each reaction based on instinct and experience. The Teru instructor narrowed his eyes, his arms uncrossing, as he leaned slightly forward, watching the display with growing irritation and something else, something closer to doubt. He had trained warriors from across a dozen systems, had watched soldiers succeed and fail. But this was different. He'll slip up soon. He muttered more too. Himself than anyone else, he'll tire or miss a beat, and then he'll be down. But the human didn't slip up. In fact, he got faster. His movements became tighter, sharper as more holograms activated and entered the fray. He moved into the attacks instead of backing away. He closed distance, nullifying longer-range strikes by crowding the space and forcing his opponents to adjust their angles. That alone was a high-level tactic. Most cadets wouldn't dare attempt, not without powered armor to buffer them each. Deflection was precise, each strike methodical. And when he did take hits, they were glancing, not direct, absorbed in ways that reduced impact or redirected force. The human was bleeding lightly from a cut on his shoulder, Sweat gathered along his brow, but there was no hesitation in his stance. No sign of retreat. It was as if he had trained for this very scenario over and over again until the moves were part of his muscle memory, and even the instructors began to question what they were seeing from the viewing platform. Several visiting officers began murmuring among themselves, exchanging glances that ranged from confusion to concern. The cadets on the ground, however, couldn't look away. Their understanding of combat, of survival, of what was necessary to succeed, was being unraveled in real time right in front of them. One of them whispered, "I thought Deathworlders relied on gear to make up for how fragile they are. But he doesn't need anything. He's faster than the simulations," the Teru instructor was, silent for a moment, then raised his voice enough to call across the field. Enough he commanded the holograms, froze mid-strike weapons, halted in midair, and then faded. The human stood alone, breathing hard, his fists still clenched, but his posture unshaken, impressive. The instructor admitted, finally walking forward, but he wasn't smiling. There was no pride in his tone, just a cautious respect and perhaps a touch of frustration. This display had not gone as expected, and now they were left grappling with the realization that a being from one of the most dangerous planets in the known galaxy had just dismantled a combat simulation that routinely injured elite cadets without using a single piece of protective equipment. The Teru gestured toward the weapons rack. "Choose something, let's see what you can do with a real weapon." But the human didn't even glance at it. He simply replied, "I don't need one." And with that short, simple sentence, everything changed again. The alien cadets gasped. Some looked at each. Other in disbelief, others stared slack-jawed at the human who had just dismissed the very tools they had been trained to depend on. A weapon was not just a tool, it was a necessity, or so they had been told. Yet here stood a creature who defied every expectation, every rule, and made it look easy. And the worst part, the truly terrifying part, was that deep down, every cadet in that moment realized he hadn't even been trying his hardest, not yet. The moment the instructor gave the command, the air shifted as if the gravity itself thickened under the weight of what was about to unfold. The holographic enemies surrounding the human lit up, in sequence one by one, activating in coordinated movements, each representing a distinct form of threat. Some mimicked high-speed slashes, others heavy blunt strikes meant to incapacitate, while several lunged in stabbing formations meant to test reaction time. Every angle was covered, every approach calculated to overwhelm, and yet in the middle of it all, the human stood. Like a boulder in the surf, unshaken eyes tracking the sequence of lights without fear or hesitation, to the alien cadets observing from the perimeter. This was madness, no training, no armor, and yet he looked more prepared than any of them had ever felt in full gear. The first spear came from the side low and fast, meant to catch the ribs where armor might gap. The human didn't just dodge it, he anticipated it. His body twisted before the tip got close, and his hand shot out, seizing the shaft with him. Effortless precision and using its momentum to throw the attacker off balance. The crowd gasped, some clutching their hands tightly, others frozen mouths slightly open. The simulation was designed for elite performance, tailored to expose flaws and punish slow reactions. But the human responded like he had studied the attack patterns for years, even though everyone knew the patterns randomized differently for each run. Still, he moved with certainty, like a predator dancing through the rain without missing a step. The next threat came from overhead, a massive mace descending fast with simulated force, enough to crush bone if it connected. But the human stepped to the left, not a step too far, not an inch wasted. His movement was economical, focused, and precise. Then his right arm swung up in a clean arc, punching through the midsection of the hologram, not to destroy it, but to disable it. The way a master would exploit structural weakness rather than overpower an opponent. It flickered and fell, backward light failing as it collapsed out of the ring, and in the silence that followed it was clear something was wrong, or rather something was too right. The instructors exchanged glances, a few muttering into their comms while the cadets began whispering in disbelief. One turned to another and said, "I thought these were supposed to be lethal simulations," and his friend answered, "They are? But he's making it look like a warm-up." More enemies advanced twin blades from the front, a polearm from the back, and a feint from the side, all timed within milliseconds of each other, designed to trip up the mind and force a mistake. And yet the human ducked under the polearm, pivoted into the twin blade attacker, forcing them to delay and turn the feint into a wasted effort. His leg swept back, dropping one of the attackers, while his hand deflected another. And it wasn't raw power that carried him through. It was coordination, timing, and adaptability, all executed in the blink of an eye. The Teru instructor narrowed his eyes from the upper platform, something in his posture shifting from annoyance to reluctant interest. He had seen elite warriors falter during this stage of the drill, but the human was not just surviving, he was adapting faster than the program could escalate at the edge of the field. One cadet muttered, "There's no tech, no implants, no energy shielding. How is he still standing?" And another responded quietly, "That's not training, that's instinct. The way he moves, it's like he's not even thinking, just reacting." The human was now breathing heavier, sweat beginning to line his forehead, but his eyes remained locked onto each new incoming threat, as if daring it to make a move. His bare skin showed signs of light bruises, but he welcomed them rather than fear them. They seemed to fuel his resolve. The next wave of holograms surged forward faster and tighter in formation. They pressed him harder than before, but his style evolved in real time. He stopped simply defending and began pressing. Back not wildly, but surgically. One blow to the wrist disarmed an attacker, another step inward collapsed the distance and nullified the reach of a halberd. Then with a twist of his torso, he hurled another hologram to the ground, and all of it happened in less than 10 seconds. Vu, one of the younger cadets, stared in horror, his voice shaking. This isn't just skill. It's something else. He shouldn't be this fast. Not in this simulation. Not without equipment. The Syrian next to him kept his arms crossed, but his voice was low. "This is what they are," he whispered, "Deathworlders. Everything on their planet tries to kill them every day of their lives, and somehow they survive. They don't rely on tech. They are the tech, they are the weapon." And that thought lingered heavy in the minds of every cadet present as the human moved with a predator's awareness, constantly recalibrating, adapting, and executing strategies as if the entire battle had been choreographed for him alone. Another cadet whispered his motion is perfect. How is that even possible? How do you train like that without enhancements? And someone else said, maybe you don't, maybe you're just born into it. Maybe Earth makes monsters? The true instructor said nothing as the human continued to eliminate threats one by one. But inside his mind, gears turned rapidly. This was no ordinary demonstration. This was a challenge to everything they taught in this academy, a contradiction to their belief that superior armor and weaponry were the cornerstones of survival. The human was rewriting the equation in real time, and the room of alien cadets were the witnesses. His movements began to shift again as the simulation stepped up into maximum tempo. Blades moved like blurs, energy pulses simulated recoil and disruption, and yet the human's body never seemed to falter. Each motion fed into the next. He ducked under a blade, caught an incoming energy baton with both hands, and used it to flip the hologram behind him, all without losing momentum, all while barefoot and barehanded. The impact was no longer just technical, it was psychological. The cadets were rattled. They had been trained in environments with safeguards, simulations that reinforced certain methods of survival. But this human was operating without those safeguards and thriving. And slowly the whispers turned to silence as every eye on that field began to realize what they were actually watching. Not a display of bravery or ego, but a declaration. A simple, clear message that if this was a human without armor, what would one look like with it as the final wave of attackers closed in? The human moved like a storm-controlled, deliberate, and untouchable. His muscles fired like tightly wound cables. His balance never shifted out of line, and his breath stayed steady as if his body had already adapted to the stress and was simply working through a plan it had rehearsed 1,000 times before. And when the last hologram dropped, fading into fractured light, the human stood alone once more, and The middle of the arena, chest-heaving skin, slick with sweat and bruises dotting his shoulders. But his expression remained composed, almost detached, as if this was simply another day, another run through familiar territory. For a moment no one spoke, even the Teru instructor stood silent, his pride buried under the sheer magnitude of what he had just witnessed. The longer the drill went on, the more the alien cadets realized they were no longer observing a test of skill, but something far more profound. Something that unsettled them in ways they had not been prepared for. At first they had whispered in disbelief, stunned by the sight of a Deathworlder engaging high-intensity combat, simulations without armor, without weapons, and yet surviving each wave with the calm control of a master. But now their silence spoke louder than any protest. Eyes wide, breathing shallow, every movement of the human chipped away at their understanding of what constituted strength and survival. Vu clutched his hands in front of him, his skin a shade paler than before, sweat gathering around his neck as he leaned slightly forward, watching as the human ducked another sweeping strike, then countered with a simple yet perfectly timed elbow to the rib section of a charging hologram. The simulation flickered, signaling a successful disablement, and Vu whispered again, to no one in particular, "This isn't possible. This goes against everything we've been taught. He doesn't even have a shield or internal reinforcement modules. How is he still moving?" The Syrian beside him, a taller cadet with gray-scaled skin and bright, reflective eyes, responded flatly, his voice dry. "I don't see any enhancements. No kinetic dampeners, no neural uplinks, no glow of nanite implants. That's just him, raw and unfiltered." Another cadet, a younger Wreath who had barely passed his first combat theory exam, added softly, "I thought their species needed armor just to survive on their planet. How can one of them handle this simulation better than any of us?" The silence among them deepened as the human's form continued to glide between attacks, dodging, sidestepping, pivoting, turning every potential threat into an opportunity. His movements were not only effective, they were mesmerizing. There was a rhythm to them, like a language of violence that only he spoke, and the simulation simply responded to it like a hesitant partner in an aggressive dance. A few cadets who had previously rolled their eyes at the human's arrival now found themselves swallowing, their pride unsure whether they were witnessing bravery, insanity, or something more terrifying altogether. This was not bravado. They began to realize this was not an act put on to earn respect or intimidate. This was normal to him. This was muscle memory. His heart rate barely climbed even as the attacks grew more vicious. Two holograms charged from opposite sides, simulating a coordinated spear and blade maneuver meant to test tracking and peripheral vision. The human stepped inward, letting the momentum of their strikes pass him by before using a sweeping motion to disarm one attacker and throw the other off balance. His eyes never left the center of the formation, his body already anticipating the next sequence. One Syrian cadet leaned toward his partner, his voice tight. He's reacting before the simulations finish their attack protocols. He's not responding. He's predicting, he's adapting in real time. It doesn't make sense. How can someone read random patterns that fast? Vu bit his lip, trying to suppress the anxious thoughts spiraling through his mind. Every lesson, every lecture had reinforced the same idea: rely on your gear, your analysis tools, your HUD, your squad mates. But this human was proving that pure instinct and rigorous training could overcome the most advanced scenarios even in the absence of support. As the hologram surged again with increased tempo, the human's movements became sharper, more aggressive, his strikes not just defensive, but calculated attacks that neutralized enemies in waves. He grabbed a simulated blade from a defeated enemy and used it as a blunt object to knock another off course before discarding it entirely, preferring his bare fists. His knuckles already bruised his forearms, marked by light cuts, but his posture never faltered. Vu could no longer stay silent. He turned to his group, his voice trembling. "This isn't training anymore. This is art. This is like watching a creature built for combat move through a room full of children. It's not fair." The others didn't respond. Some nodded, some stayed still, eyes fixed on the human whose limbs never stopped moving, whose focus remained unbroken, and in that moment the truth began to settle deep within them. He didn't just survive Earth, he thrived on it. Everything about his body, his reflexes, his resilience spoke of a world where the weak died young, and the strong were forged not just in physical trials, but in constant environmental hostility. The Syrian beside Vo finally said what many were, thinking their world, it isn't like ours. Earth is full of gravity predators, bacteria, natural disasters, and weather extremes that would wipe out most of our colonies, and yet they endure, they get stronger, they evolve, and then they leave that world and come to places like this. And this is what happens. The realization began to change the atmosphere among the cadets, from curiosity to anxiety. The simulation was no longer entertainment, it was a warning. Each move of the human, each strike, each dodge told a silent story of survival at a level they had never imagined. Vu's shoulders sagged slightly as if the weight of the truth pressed down on him, harder than the gravity field around them. He murmured, "This changes everything, doesn't it?" One of the Syrian cadets nodded slowly, staring without blinking. "It does if they can do this without armor. What happens when they use everything at their disposal? Full gear, full weapons, full technology, and squad tactics. What then? Even the senior cadets, some of whom had years of experience and completed drills under fire scenarios, were forced to confront a hard truth. The human hadn't just excelled in a test designed to push them to the limit, he had redefined what the limit was. He had walked into a simulation meant to expose flaws, and instead exposed everyone else's fear. Vu looked back toward the center of the arena, just as the human caught a mace simulation. Mid-swing, turned it aside with his arm and countered with a strike that caused the program to crash. Entirely, the students gasped, unable to process the speed, the strength, the precision, even as sweat poured from the human's skin, and bruises began to decorate his arms and chest. He showed no hesitation, only clarity, only resolve. The human wasn't showing off. He was surviving and thriving, and the cadets knew then that survival was no longer a concept they truly understood, not in the way this Deathworlder did, and that realization was what made the silence around the training ground so complete. So, unnerving, the fear they felt wasn't rooted in hatred or superiority. It came from awe. It came from the undeniable knowledge that everything they thought made a soldier strong might be irrelevant when facing someone who didn't need armor, didn't need weapons, didn't even need reassurance, just purpose and discipline and the will to win. No matter the cost, when the instructor gave the command to initiate the advanced drill, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The air grew dense, not from physical change, but from the sheer weight of what it meant. Everyone knew this phase of the training was reserved only for the most elite seasoned cadets, veterans of real combat who had already proven themselves under fire. The simulation would ramp up to full synchronization with maximum pattern variance and minimum telegraphing meaning. Each holographic attacker would move unpredictably with real speed, real coordination, and simulated force capable of breaking bones and destroying equipment. And yet the human didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He didn't even show concern. He simply took a long breath, adjusted his footing, and let a faint smile creep across his face. The kind of smile that didn't belong on a soldier facing overwhelming odds, but on a fighter who knew something no one else did. The holograms closed in from all directions, forming a complete circle around him, every one of them armed with weapons representing the most dangerous, close combat scenarios in the galaxy. Some held whirring blades, others had energy whips or pulse rifles fixed with bayonets, and all of them calibrated to react faster and smarter than anything the average soldier would ever face in live conditions. The Teru instructor stood at the edge, arms crossed, his eyes locked on the center, waiting to see the moment the human would stumble, waiting for proof that even a Deathworlder had limits. But the moment never came. When the simulation began, the human exploded into action, not with panic or sloppiness, but with the deliberate rhythm of someone who had spent every day of their life sharpening instinct into precision. His first movement was a pivot, a low turn that allowed him to sweep the legs of the nearest attacker while simultaneously deflecting a blade strike aimed at his back with an elbow twist that sent the weapon flying. He didn't stop to reassess. He flowed into the next motion, his body bending, dodging, slipping under an arc of light, slicing through the air, and coming up behind another enemy whose programming couldn't even recalibrate before it was knocked off balance and removed from the formation. It was not luck, it was control. Every second that passed, the simulation grew more aggressive, more chaotic, throwing combinations of attacks at him designed to disorient, to exhaust, to break him down. But the human moved like water flowing into the gaps of every assault, using one hologram's movement against another, redirecting weapons not with brute strength, but with minimal effort placed exactly where it mattered. One cadet, watching from the sidelines, gripped the edge of the railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. "He's not just fighting," he whispered. "He's playing with it." Another replied in a tone that was half admiration, half fear. "No one's ever passed this drill without armor, without injuries, without weapons. The way he moves, it's like the attacks don't even matter." The Teru instructor's jaw tightened as he watched the human disarm yet another simulation and spin around to drive his palm into the chest of a second opponent, causing it to glitch and vanish. The instructor muttered to himself, "That's impossible. No one should be able to handle this. Many pattern shifts this quickly." The human's breathing began to deepen, but his movements remained sharp, every motion a study in balance and momentum. His hands struck with precision. His feet stayed grounded, never overextended, never wasted. Even when the drill threw new weapons into the mix like a spiked flail or a plasma edge, the human adapted mid-sequence, never losing rhythm, as if his body was already wired to fight in any condition, any setting at any time. The cadets around the ring watched in absolute silence. Many of them had gone through this same drill and failed. Most had been knocked down in the first 2 minutes, yet here stood a being from a planet they once mocked or feared for its hostility, making their worst simulation look like an exercise in patience. At one point, 2 of the holograms synchronized their attacks, one sweeping low while the other aimed high, a classic combination designed to force the opponent into a no-win situation. But the human leapt, timing the jump so that his body twisted in midair, avoiding both and landing in a perfect crouch between them, and before they could reset their weapons, he moved, driving his fist into the abdomen of one and grabbing the wrist of the other, yanking it forward and using its own momentum to shatter its formation. He didn't stop. He never stopped the simulation. Pressed harder, holograms began to strike in overlapping patterns. Attacks layered so that response to one meant exposure to another, but the human responded in a way none of the instructors expected. He began to go on the offensive, not wildly, but with terrifying calculation. He started predicting the flow, not just reacting, but anticipating steps ahead, adjusting his stance before the enemy moved, angling his body to counter before the strike even launched. It was no longer defense. It was dominance. One of the cadets whispered, "This isn't training, this is something else entirely. He's learning the simulation faster than it can adapt." Another added, "I thought these were randomized sequences. How can he read them like that?" And a third muttered, "Maybe he doesn't read them. Maybe he just knows what combat feels like, what real danger is, and everything we face in here is just a game to him." The Teru instructor could feel the fear starting to bleed into his cadets, the awe shifting into quiet dread as their beliefs about war and combat shattered under the weight of one man's performance. The simulation reached maximum output. Weapons glowed with heightened energy, pulses moved faster than the eye could follow, and still the human pressed forward, sweat dripping down his temples, bruises spreading across his shoulders and sides, but his eyes never wavered. Focused, sharp, locked on to the next opponent. Before it even took a step, he caught an energy baton and used it as a lever to spin his opponent into another, redirecting both their attacks into open air. He then disarmed one, ripped the weapon from its fading grip, and hurled it at a third, knocking it off balance and taking it down with a single fluid kick to the chest. Another simulation tried to flank him, but he turned as if he sensed the danger from pure instinct. Alone ducked the strike and countered with an upward elbow that left a faint trail of light as the projection disintegrated. The cadets couldn't believe it, and neither could the instructors. It had become clear that what they were watching wasn't an anomaly or a one-off display of luck. This was the product of years of surviving on a planet that punished weakness. This was the result of training not just the body, but the mind. The human never lost composure, never gave ground, and never relied on equipment. Instead, he had shown them what it meant to turn survival into mastery. As the last of the holograms deactivated, the human stood alone once again, his chest rising and falling, his arms speckled with bruises and light cuts, but his expression unchanged, calm, grounded, and alert. He looked up toward the instructor, his gaze unwavering, and in that instant, every cadet understood. They were not watching someone who had survived the worst of a death world. They were watching someone who had become better because of it, someone who had taken hardship and forged it into weaponized discipline, someone who had no use for simulations because real life had taught him everything he needed to know about how to fight and how to win. As the final holograms faded and the simulation powered down, leaving only the quiet hum of the training systems behind, the human remained standing at the center of the arena, his body marked by sweat, bruises, and light cuts. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths, but there was no sign of fear or fatigue, only focus and control. The alien cadets surrounding the platform remained speechless, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The silence held until the Teru instructor finally stepped forward, his heavy footsteps echoing across the steel floor. He approached the human, slowly stopping just a few paces away. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in deep consideration and perhaps reluctant respect. "You prove a point," he said, his voice low and rough. "But tell me, human, what do you gain by refusing armor, by rejecting tools and facing these drills with bare skin?" The human wiped a trickle of sweat from his brow and looked the instructor in the eye, his voice calm but unwavering. "Armor is a tool," he said, "and tools can fail when your body is tired and your gear breaks. What do you have left? Nothing, unless you train your mind and your body to be the weapon." The instructor raised an eyebrow, his tone skeptical. "You really believe your body is enough to overcome the galaxy's threats?" The human didn't flinch. "No, but it gives me an edge," he answered. "When things go wrong, when systems fail, when the odds turn against you, you have to be able to keep fighting. You have to know that even without the tech, without the backup, you can rely on yourself. That's what makes the difference." The cadets looked at each other, uncertain, some confused, some shaken. They had always been taught that technology was the pinnacle of combat strategy: shields, enhancements, tracking systems, targeting AI. Those were the tools that separated victory from defeat. Yet here stood a being who had just outperformed every elite simulation with no aid, no equipment, no external support, just raw training discipline and grit. Vu, still trembling from what he had seen, stepped closer and asked, his voice soft but desperate, "Does that mean humans don't need gear to fight? Do you believe it makes you better?" The human glanced at him and replied, "We use what we have. Just like anyone else, armor, guns, tech. Those are helpful, but they're not who we are. The problem is when you start believing they define you." The cadets grew quiet, the idea settling heavily among them like dust after a storm. The Teru instructor tilted his head, studying the man in front of him. This was not arrogance. He realized it was philosophy. It was belief rooted in experience, in pain, and struggle. Something deeper than tactical preference. This was a creed forged by necessity, by growing up in an environment so hostile that even the strongest species in the galaxy would barely survive a week. Vu muttered again, half to himself, but loud enough to be heard. "This changes everything. If you can fight like this with nothing, what happens when you fight with everything?" The Syrian next to him nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the human. "I don't think I want to find out," he said. The human took a step back, letting his muscles relax just slightly, but his eyes never lost their sharpness. This wasn't a performance for show. It was who he was at his core. The instructor sensed the discomfort among his cadets and turned to face them, his voice loud and commanding. "Remember this day," he said. "Remember what you've seen. You are training to fight a species that doesn't rely on the things you do. They don't wait for orders. They don't depend on equipment. They are trained to think, adapt, and endure. Their strength comes not from tools, but from something within themselves. And that is far more dangerous than any weapon." The human watched silently as the instructor continued. Because war is not about who has the best armor, or the biggest fleet, or the most advanced tactics. It's about who can survive, who can adapt when things fall apart, who keeps going. When the odds are impossible, the cadets listened, eyes wide, expressions tight. They had never been told this, not in the countless hours of lectures or tactical briefings. This wasn't something you found in a manual. This was something you learned the hard way, and today they had seen it firsthand. Vu raised a hand again, unable to keep the fear from his voice. Instructor, what does this mean for the war? The instructor paused, his eyes shifting from the human back to the cadets. It means, he said slowly, that everything we thought we knew about the battlefield may not apply anymore. The human crossed his arms, a faint smirk playing at the edge of his mouth as he added, "You think this is impressive? You should see what happens when we actually fight." And that single sentence struck like a thunderclap through the group. The drills had been intense, yes, but they were still simulations, limited by program boundaries and controlled parameters. What would it look like when this human and others like him stepped into a real war zone? With real weapons, real armor, real stakes, Vu felt his stomach twist at the thought. If this is them holding back, then what are they at full strength? The instructor exhaled and muttered enough theory, turning to the human. He said, "Then we test it one final time for real. No more programs, no more holograms." The cadets gasped. Several spoke up at once, objecting, questioning, but the instructor silenced them all. He stepped forward slowly and said, "You won't be facing another simulation. You'll face me armed and ready against you. Unarmored." The human showed no surprise, no concern, just nodded once as if to say, "Fine, let's end this." The tension in the air became suffocating as the realization sank in. This was no longer a lesson, it was a confrontation, a reckoning of ideologies forged from different worlds and different beliefs. And every cadet knew that whatever the outcome, the true lesson had already been delivered loud and clear. Survival wasn't just about strength or speed or equipment, it was about resilience, discipline, and the unshakable belief that no matter the odds, you could still win. The arena grew still as the weight of the instructor's challenge settled into the minds of every cadet watching. This was no longer about drills, simulations, or hypothetical scenarios. This was going to be a live demonstration of raw combat between two warriors, one a veteran instructor armed with a real weapon, the other a human. Bare-handed, unarmored, and unshaken, the Teru instructor walked slowly to the weapons rack, his movements deliberate, every footstep echoing with finality as he picked up a training spear, its edge gleaming under the arena lights. The cadets could hardly believe what they were witnessing. Never in the history of the academy had an instructor personally engaged in a live combat challenge against a cadet, especially not one from a species considered volatile and unpredictable. This was not protocol. This was something deeper, perhaps a final test of pride, or a need to understand what he had just seen with his own eyes as he turned to face the human. The arena seemed to hold its breath. The cadets stood frozen, some leaning forward, some gripping the railings of the observation deck, others exchanging glances filled with fear, awe, and confusion. "Ready yourself," the instructor growled. The human did not move dramatically. He simply squared his shoulders, adjusted his stance, and locked eyes with the Teru. His muscles tensed, his feet light on the ground, his breath even as if this were no more dangerous than what he had already faced. The instructor lunged first, using the spear in a controlled thrust aimed at the human's center mass. The type of attack meant to test reflex and commitment. The cadets flinched collectively, expecting, perhaps, that this was finally the moment where the human would falter, but he didn't. In one seamless motion, he stepped to the side, twisted his torso, and caught the shaft of the spear mid-strike. The force of the attack redirected through his body and transferred outward as he yanked the weapon forward, using the instructor's own momentum against him. It was a move so fast, so efficient, that the weapon was ripped from the instructor's hands before he could even adjust. And then in the same motion, the human spun, pivoted his body, and brought the spear back in a wide arc, stopping it just inches from the instructor's throat. Time seemed to stop. The cadets stared, unblinking. The instructor stood motionless, the blade hovering close enough to feel the heat from the energy core embedded in its edge. The human held it steady, breathing controlled posture. Relaxed, he let the weapon drop, clattering to the ground beside them. Then he spoke. It's not about strength, it's about using what's available. Adapting to the situation in a real fight. It's not about who has the best weapon or armor. It's about who can survive. The words hit harder than any strike. The cadets didn't know what to say. The instructor stood frozen for a moment longer, then slowly nodded, the tension easing from his body as he exhaled deeply. "And you human," he said, his voice quieter, "are built for survival more than any of us." He turned to face the gathered cadets, who still stood in stunned silence, their faces marked with shock, confusion, and something else, a dawning awareness. "This lesson today," he said slowly, "is not just about combat. It is about understanding your enemy, about challenging your assumptions, realizing the limits you think exist may not be real. Underestimating a human," he paused, looking directly at each of them, "is the last mistake you will ever make." The human said nothing as he began to walk away. His job done, his statement made, but Vu, still shaken, called out, his voice cracking with nervous tension. "Wait, are you saying humans are unbeatable?" The human stopped, turned slightly, his eyes cold, but not unkind. "No," he said, "we can be beaten, but you'll have to work for it, because while you're calculating odds and measuring weapons and adjusting your armor, we're already moving, and once we start, we don't stop until we win." His words were not spoken with arrogance or flair. They were simply truth laid bare, spoken by someone who had lived it, who had earned the right to speak that way, and that truth sank into the hearts of every alien cadet present, like a stone dropped into still water. Its ripples would spread far beyond this arena, far beyond this single confrontation. As the human left the field behind him, the instructor remained for a moment before turning to his students one last time. "This war," he said, "will test us in ways we've never imagined. The humans may not be invincible, but they are relentless. They fight not just with weapons, but with their very being. Their will to survive is something we do not yet understand, and that is what makes them dangerous. Remember this the next time you face one of them on the battlefield. You are not just facing muscle and bone or armor and tactics. You are facing a mind that refuses to break a spirit, that refuses to stop a being forged in adversity, that will not surrender just because the odds are against them." The cadets said nothing, not because they were unwilling, but because there were no words to respond with. They had just witnessed something that defied their training, their logic, their expectations. They had seen a creature from a planet they only knew through rumors and briefings take on the deadliest drills and then face their top instructor with nothing but his hands, and win not with brute force but with clarity, calm, and control. They had seen not just the potential of humanity, but the terrifying promise of what might come if those like him entered the war at full strength. Vo leaned against the railing, his legs weak, his heart still racing, his voice barely a whisper. "This changes everything, doesn't it?" And the Syrian beside him replied without looking away from the now empty arena. "It does, and I think the galaxy is not ready for it." As the last echoes of the final challenge faded and the dust settled across the training ground, the alien cadets remained frozen in place, their eyes still locked on the space where the human had stood only moments ago. They had witnessed something they could not easily explain or forget, something that defied everything they had been taught about combat, about strength, and about survival. Their minds struggled to process what they had seen, a being with no armor, no weapons, no augmentation, taking on the most advanced simulations, and a live armed instructor and emerging victorious without hesitation, without faltering, without fear. It was not just the display of skill that haunted them. It was what it revealed about the nature of humans, not simply that they were strong or fast, but that they were something entirely different, something forged in fire and raised in chaos, something that did not just survive adversity, but seemed to draw strength from it. Vo stood silently among the others, still trying to steady his breath, his palms sweaty and his thoughts spinning. He turned slowly to his companion, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did we just see what I think we saw?" The Syrian next to him, didn't answer at first. His eyes were distant, his jaw tight. Finally, he said yes, and I don't think any of us are ready to understand it completely. Another cadet nearby leaned forward, his voice raw and uncertain. That was supposed to be the hardest drill, the most lethal level of simulation, and he didn't just pass it, he dominated it, like it wasn't even a challenge, another added. And when the instructor stepped in, he still held his ground, like it didn't change anything. Like facing a real weapon was no different than facing code. The realization began to spread through the cadets like a cold, slow-moving wave. This had not been about winning a drill. It had been a message, a demonstration. Not of power alone, but of what humans really were, creatures born on a world that, by every galactic standard, should have extinguished them. Predators, viruses, gravity storms, fire drought. They grew up in conditions so harsh they had no choice but to become tougher than everything that tried to kill them. The instructors always spoke of adaptation as a strength, but they had never imagined it could be taken this far. The human had turned adaptation into an art, into a weapon, and today he had wielded it against them, not to harm, but to show them something more important. The Teru, instructor still standing near the center of the field, looked around at his students, his voice steady but low. This was not a lesson in technique. He said it was a warning, not from him, but from the universe itself, about what happens when you underestimate the wrong kind of enemy. The cadets were silent, their thoughts tangled and heavy with uncertainty. They had trained for years to fight using the most advanced tech, the best tactics, the finest armor, and yet all of it had crumbled in the face of a man who needed none of it. Vu finally found his voice again, his words slow and cautious. What does it mean for the war? If this is how humans fight, what happens when they enter the battlefield fully equipped? The instructor looked at him, then at the rest of the cadets, who now stared back, with faces drained of arrogance and filled with unease. It means, he said, that everything we thought we understood about the enemy needs to be re-examined. It means that some of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy don't look dangerous until it's too late. It means that survival for them is not a goal, it's a state of being. The humans' words echoed once more in their minds. We can be beaten, but you'll have to work for it. And suddenly those words didn't feel like a boast. They felt like a challenge, a promise that when the time came, when war was no longer a theoretical threat, but a reality, the humans would be the ones who moved first, who struck first, who adapted first, and who would keep going long after others had broken or fallen behind. The cadets began to disperse slowly, still speaking in hushed tones, still exchanging theories and fears, still trying to piece together the new image of humanity that had been carved into their understanding. Not one of brute conquerors, but of relentless survivors, the kind of species that didn't just endure pain, but used it like fuel. The kind that didn't need weapons to be deadly or armor to be invincible. The kind that didn't need to be the strongest to win, just the last ones standing as they walked away. Some glanced back at the field one more time, as if expecting the human to still be there, standing in the same place, calm and waiting for the next test. But he was gone, having left behind only the memory of his actions and the questions that would haunt them for days, weeks, possibly for the rest of their military careers. What did it mean to face an enemy like that? What did it mean to prepare for war against a species whose entire culture revolved around surviving the impossible? Vu clenched his fists, his thoughts spiraling faster than he could control. If this was just one of them, what were the others like? How many more trained the same way? How many more looked at battle not as a struggle but as a familiar exercise? How many more were waiting on the edge of the galaxy, ready to act when called? The Teru instructor turned back once more to address his cadets before they left. Remember this, he said, his voice now firmer. This is not about fear, it is about awareness. You have seen what a human can do, not when armed, not when reinforced, but when stripped down to nothing. And still they fought harder than anyone else in this academy. This is not weakness, this is the essence of their strength, their refusal to break, their refusal to slow, their refusal to be anything other than what they are built for: survival, driven by necessity and made dangerous by the very fact that they are never truly out of the fight. So train harder, think faster, be ready. Because the next time you face one of them, it may not be in a controlled arena, and you will not have the luxury of surprise. The war is coming, And now you know what walks beside you or what stands against you, depending on which side of the field you choose to stand. As the cadets stood in heavy silence, still shaken by what they had seen, the Teru instructor slowly stepped forward, his boots echoing against the metallic ground, his eyes hard yet thoughtful, his voice deep and measured. "You have witnessed combat," he began, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "You have studied tactics, memorized formations, analyzed threat models, and adapted to hundreds of simulations, but none of that means anything if you do not understand what truly determines survival today. You saw a human face every kind of attack this academy can throw at a soldier, without armor, without enhancements, without even a weapon. And still he endured, still he overcame every challenge, because it was never about the equipment, it was about the mindset, the will, the unrelenting refusal to surrender. That is what makes them dangerous. That is what makes them different." The cadets did not respond. They simply listened, eyes fixed on him, as if every word were a lifeline, dragging them toward understanding. The instructor turned and looked toward the area where the human had stood, where only moments before he had turned back and delivered one final truth. "We can be beaten, but you'll have to work for it. And in that one sentence," the instructor said, "lies a lesson greater than any drill can teach. It is not about arrogance. It is not about intimidation. It is a warning, a challenge, and a truth. Humans are not built for perfection. They are not the strongest or the fastest or the most advanced, but they are relentless. They do not wait for conditions to be favorable. They make do with what they have, and they move forward. They fail, they fall, they get back up, and they try again and again and again until they win. That is what you are dealing with, and that is what you must become if you want to survive what comes next." He turned to face the entire group, his eyes scanning every face, every expression. "If you believe your weapons will carry you, if you believe your technology will save you, you are already defeated, because the battlefield does not care about your gear. The enemy will not wait for your systems to calibrate or your teammates to arrive. The fight begins when you least expect it and ends only when someone refuses to stop fighting. And today that someone was a Deathworlder. A human trained not just with simulations, but with suffering forged not in classrooms, but in chaos." The cadets began to shift uncomfortably, each one recalling the sheer speed, the precision, the brutal effectiveness of the human's movements, the way he adapted to every new threat, as if born to react, the way he took hits and kept going, the way he never once looked afraid. Vu whispered almost to himself. "It felt like we were watching something ancient, something that shouldn't exist, but does." The instructor nodded as if hearing him, perhaps because there is something timeless in the way they fight, something primal, something born of necessity. Earth is not kind, and those who survive it do not come out unmarked. They come out prepared. They come out ready, and that readiness is what gives them an edge. One that cannot be copied, only earned. And that brings us to the final lesson. The one none of you expected, the one no simulation could prepare you for. The human walked into our world today and showed us what it means to be unbreakable. Not because of strength, but because of belief. Belief in himself, belief in his training, belief in something deeper than protocol and strategy and armor, something you cannot fabricate or inject or simulate. The cadets stood in silence, some staring at the floor, others looking at their hands as if wondering whether they had what it took to do the same. The instructor continued, "This is your turning point. You can walk away from this unchanged, continue believing that the lessons in your books will save you, or you can accept the truth that today was a gift, a glimpse into what real warriors look like and why the galaxy fears them. Not because they are invincible, but because they do not stop, because they are already moving when the rest of us are still planning. And now I want each of you to ask yourselves, when the war truly comes, when the alarms sound, and you stand face to face with someone who will not yield, will you hesitate or will you be ready?" And as the cadets slowly nodded their expressions, hardening their backs, straightening their doubts, slowly being replaced with something else, something like determination, the instructor stepped back, his voice firm. "Then prepare yourselves, train not just your bodies but your minds, strip away everything you rely on and find out what you really are. Because one day everything you have might fail, and when that happens, you will have to decide if you are a fighter or just another casualty. And in that moment, the arena did not feel like a training ground. It felt like the beginning of something greater, a place where the line between myth and reality had blurred, where stories of unstoppable warriors from Deathworlds were no longer exaggerated tales, but hard truths etched into bruised skin and calloused hands. And as the cadets left the field, each step heavier with understanding, they knew they would never forget what they had seen, because once you witnessed the raw spirit of someone who refuses to break, you cannot go back to who you were before. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. Not just for warriors, not just for aliens preparing for war, but for anyone in any world at any time. Life does not care if you are ready. Life will test you, break you, force you into corners where nothing makes sense and everything hurts. And in those moments, it will not be your equipment or your credentials that save you. It will be your will, your heart, your choice to stand up and move forward when every instinct tells you to give in. And that lesson, that mindset is not just for soldiers. It is for anyone who faces hardship, for anyone who fights battles unseen, for anyone who wakes up in pain and decides to try again. And so as the stars rose over the academy and the echoes of the humans' footsteps faded into memory, what remained was not just fear or admiration, but a seed of change, a shift in how these young beings saw the world. And perhaps themselves, for the first time, they understood that greatness was not given. It was earned in the fire, in the fall, and the rise. And if they wanted to survive the war, and more importantly, if they wanted to grow into something worthy of that battlefield, they would have to start now, and they would have to start within